This is what I have to say about that. If your end result is for fun, your mold doesn't have to be precise. And everything he did here is not incorrect at all. It's just a little more expensive and a little more time consuming than is my preference. Hi, I'm Michael Joy. Welcome back to another Hand-ufacturing reaction video. I found this, this is Brick in the Yard or something. I found these videos the other day and I thought they were really terrific and I started watching some of them. I believe it was a small business owner and he was a distributor of materials, and I fast forwarded through his story because I really liked how he presented, and I saw that he stopped selling something. There's a story there about his business closing after 20 years. I did like his approach to mold making, and so we're going to get into it because you can't be a material supplier and a professional mold maker at the same time. You're busy selling, but let's watch.
Making a two-piece mold with 5140 platinum silicone. In this tutorial, we're going to show the process of making a two-piece mold or a two-sided mold with a resin backer. Now, this kind of mold, it's ideal to use a very firm silicone like the 5140, since we'll be casting flexible foam into this mold and it will need to withstand a decent amount of pressure. And also that very firm silicone also helps with alignment.
Okay, so we know where we're going.
Like this. Now, for this mold, we're going to be molding a pipe wrench, but it's important to remember that every three-dimensional object will present its own set of unique challenges. So let's take a look at this pipe wrench and figure out the best place to put our parting line. The parting line...
So right off the top, it's nice when the people have the intros. I wish I was better at that, but there's one thing that always ran in common in my mind is that the people that were selling the material, and look, everybody needs to make a living, but the molds were always heavy built and consumed a lot of material and sometimes used as many mold making supplies as were possible. And I'm not saying that those mold making supplies weren't valuable to have in your shop, but not all of the processes needed to pour them into one. So let's see where he's going.
Is where our mold will divide. So for this pipe wrench, this is overall pretty simple. We can actually follow the lines where this mold box is easy to make out of plywood. And then you can use C-clamps to fix that in the right position for the mold.
You know me, I like
now
the clamps, spring clamps better.
First, and in
work
order
on
to
a
define
laminated
that
table,
first half of the mold, the first part that will be poured of silicone, we're going to make a bed of clay at the bottom of this mold box. Now, if you want to move fast, the best clay to use is water-based clay. Water-based clay is easy to smooth out with water.
How do I get rid of that?
And it's inexpensive. So that's what we're going to be using here.
So this is to me, now I'm getting into the mold making styles here. This to me is not the way that I would build this mold, because what he's doing is he's building a dividing wall inside of a box, which to me is counterintuitive. I would slab this out, put the wrench in, made the parting wall, and then built the box around it. So this is backwards to me.
Make a more precise bed of clay and a more precise dividing wall using oil-based clay like our Protolino modeling clay. So I'll put a link to that in the video description along with all the other materials we're using for this mold. But real important, if you are working really fast, a lot of our prop making customers that are on a tight time crunch will sometimes pour a clay bed using monster clay or the alien clay, or use a clay bed like this of a white modeling clay. Now, one of the reasons we're using a soft clay like this is it's very easy to follow the parting line on the object. Now, this pipe wrench is unique in that it has a very straight parting line.
When you do the dividing wall this way, it's a guessing game. If you're dividing by pressure, you're not going to get a good parting wall. The thing is with silicone, it doesn't really matter because your parting wall can be off because the silicone is flexible and it's going to re-register with itself. It's not like a rigid mold for plaster mold making.
And again, because I'm molding an object that does have an actual seam on it, I want my seam to be as close to that original seam as possible. But once I press that to the point that I like where it's at, I'm going to go back in and smooth out the clay and make sure I push it right up against the object, because obviously just pushing it down into the clay bed is not going to be as precise as getting that clay pushed right up to the edge. And what we're going for here is a right angle of that clay, that bed of clay, where it comes and meets the pattern.
I would like to fast forward.
To be as close to a right angle. Now, if you're using oil-based clay with this process, you could take literally days to do this and get this as perfect as possible.
Okay.
The downside to use...
That's not true. Oil-based clay doesn't take literally days. It takes about an hour. You soften it up in the microwave, you lay it out, you trace this around, you carve out a negative impression of the wrench, and you drop it in, and you're done. So it's not always exactly true. This, to me, is the part that's taking a long time, but it's all right. It's his time.
Using water-based clay is you have to move fast, because that water-based clay will start to dry out, and if you're working working in a really dry climate, that's going to happen
I wouldn't
sooner
worry about
rather
the
than
clay
later.
drying
So
out. It's
remember,
only overnight.
as soon as you start this clay wall, you need to be ready to make this mold, because if this sits and dries out, it's going to be a big cracked mess later on. So important to remember that water-based clay dries out, and when you're using that for a parting line, you need to move quickly. So I made this parting line knowing that I was going to be pouring silicone over it within a few
You
minutes.
had many hours.
Now what I'm doing is cutting up some extra water-based clay and sculpting kind of a little funnel shape to put right down there at the bottom of the handle of the wrench. Now, because I'm mainly going to be casting expanding foam,
He has a very
it's not
nice
so much
radio
crucial
voice,
that
you
this
know?
is able to have foam poured into
But
the mold
it's
as much
killing
as to
me.
have a place for the foam, the excess foam, to release out of the mold. Now, we'll also be pouring some
Here's something interesting about this guy, because I watched a bunch of his videos, that there's not a lot of people that work with so many different materials. You know, in my shop, there was a time when I experimented with all sorts of materials, and I just got to the point, it's like, give me 1 or 2 silicones, a couple casting materials, and that's really all I need to do what my business was calling for. That didn't mean I didn't enjoy experimenting, it just meant that I was trying to simplify. I watched his other videos, and he's looking for projects to demonstrate different materials and different techniques. For him, it's not so much about a fancy mold. He wasn't selling that, he was selling the material. So I'm in tune with the activities here, but if somebody's looking to learn the mold making, this is just a basic piece of it.
Casting rubber in this, and maybe even some casting resin later on, but the main purpose of this mold will be for casting flexible foam. Now ready to apply our mold release. Now it's really important to use a mold release that does not contain silicone oil. So Zip 301 is such a release, but very important
I
here,
don't like
because
spraying.
if you use a mold release that contains silicone oil, that can cause your silicone to actually bond to the pattern. And it's also really important that we make sure we apply that to our pattern, our wrench, and of course our clay wall.
You know what I
and
feel
the
about
mold
spraying.
box, because
This is
that
breathing,
pipe wrench
it's
being
on the
made of
camera.
steel, that could attract the silicone, and we could get a bond actually between our steel wrench and our silicone. And
No,
now we're
you
ready to
won't.
take our box dimensions and figure out how much silicone it's going to take to pour the first side of the mold. Now, the formula for this is very simple.
Egyptian
Length
math.
times width into that, just so you can see when
So-
everything is thoroughly mixed.
Of course, you know, I'm always about scales, bags, and gloves and goggles. You guys hear this all the time. I'm going to say it again and again. Kay was asking off camera, well, our thing broke to commercials. Why would you even make a mold of this wrench in the first place, like other than for a build video? Well, in the special effects industry, you need to take objects that are made of metal and make them out of foam because someone's taken a hit, you know, like fake glass breaks, fake guns don't shoot, that sort of thing. So this is, for me, a film prop.
Now, another thing I'm not going to be showing here is I
He
did
should have
subject
gloves.
this to a vacuum. We put
Distributor
this in a vacuum
videos
pot
should
and pulled all the
emphasize
air bubbles out,
safety.
which is a very fast process. But again, that's where that 30-minute working time really comes in handy. We have more than
Also, there's a pouring trick. You know, this is a nice container, other than the paint containers that are really messy, but that cap, if you hold that cap close while you're pouring, you can use that cap to slice the stream and just twist it right there and you're done.
enough time to get everything thoroughly mixed and vacuum degassed and then poured over our pattern. And a quick word about thorough mixing. Thorough is the key here. You don't want to think in terms of how long you're mixing. You want to think about how thoroughly you're mixing and how accurately you're mixing. Because you could spend all day mixing, but if your stir stick never touches the sides or the bottom of the bucket, you are not mixing accurately and properly.
So this is pretty interesting. First off, I would have added pigment iron oxide. It would be good for mixing the silicone. The other thing is it's really ideal to mix in a semi-translucent bucket, because what he's saying is, it's true. If you have a semi-translucent bucket and you see not a uniform color on the side, you can tell you haven't mixed that material well. The other thing that I would do is I would often have 2 buckets, and so I would mix in one bucket, and then I would turn it and I would flip the mix, I call it, into another bucket. And then I would what's called nag the pail, and I would scrape the edges of the bucket to get it into the second one. What happens if you don't do that and he just mixes in one bucket, you pour all your silicone into the mold box, and then you're scraping the side walls of your bucket, and that may have uncured silicone in it because you didn't flip the mix altogether. So you can actually just be scraping thinking you're saving material, but you're just dragging in uncatalyzed silicone into your mix. So there's times when a 2-bucket pour is really sensible, but gloves.
So make sure you're turning that bucket and scraping the sides and the bottom of the bucket several
Yeah,
times.
rotate it.
So all of those components are properly incorporated
Okay,
in the mixture.
this is not the way I would pour silicone. If you don't have a vacuum chamber, the silicone needs to be mixed per previous, but when you pour it, raise the bucket up so it pours out in a thinner stream, and that thin stream will help stretch out the bubbles and burst them. He shouldn't have a big problem here. If your silicone is real high viscosity, that air is going to rise out, but if you were pressure casting this, you can't pour like this.
Now, an Interesting thing that I noticed with this particular pour, I pulled a vacuum on this, but I pulled this bucket of silicone out of the vacuum chamber almost as soon as it collapsed. And it was kind of strange. It had a lot of bubbles in it, and I was surprised that.
Okay, so let me talk about vacuum chambers. What you do is you mix up your silicone, A and B, you put it together, you're good to go. You need to have 3 or 4 times the empty volume of your liquid material, because when you pull the vacuum up to 29 inches of mercury, it's gonna rise and then it's gonna collapse. And if you don't have a big enough bucket, you got to bleed the valve, because it's going to go up to the top and you got to bleed the valve, drop it. Up to the top, bleed the valve, drop it. And you don't get a thorough de-airing because it hasn't gone up and then the loaf collapses. After the loaf collapses, you should de-air for 2 minutes. Don't start going longer than 2 minutes, because you'll begin to affect the structural integrity of the silicone. At least that's what a chemist told me. I had no clue, because you can't tell by looking. But let it come up, let it collapse for about 2 minutes at the most. And then you'll have a nice mix.
Had as many bubbles as it did, given that I just pulled a vacuum. But the funny thing is, those all still went away. So I'm not a scientician, so I can't explain that.
I'm not a scientician. I like that. I can't explain it. So he didn't have a pouring indication line here of where to stop, but it is a translucent material, so you can see when you have good encapsulation. I just think he overmixed the volume, but after going through all that math, it should have been a tighter pour.
But it is interesting that if you pull it out a little too early out of the vacuum chamber, those bubbles are more evident, but they still
You don't have to worry about
disappear.
these. We used to Johnny the mold afterwards, and it was a nickname named after the kid in the shop who discovered it. He got tired of these surface bubbles, and he just took a air compressor and you just go psh, 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 and it would just burst all the surfaces. You don't have to use any spray releases. You don't have to use any chemistry. You don't have to sit there and beg the bubbles. Just let them rise for a few minutes and then come back and you Johnny that mold with an air compressor, a low pressure air. It was fun.
Interesting phenomenon, and again, the more science-minded people, I'm sure, can step in and explain that anomaly to me.
It's like a stockbroker now.
This is after the pour has sat a little bit.
He was like a bold guy with me for a summer.
What I'm doing here is just going in with a stir stick and just breaking up any of the bubbles rising up. And now we're going to let the silicone cure for about 4 hours at room temperature.
Okay.
And now that it's set up, we're ready to cut some keys.
You know how I feel about scalpels. I don't like seeing people use scalpels because it's too easy to get cut by them. But really what he's about to do is cut registration keys. This is what I would call an absolutely unnecessary step, because what he's looking for is he's going to create a mother mold for this mold, because the 2 pieces of silicone, when you put them together, could kind of sag and distort. So you have to have a rigid plate on both sides of the mold. And at our shop, we would have just cut a couple pieces of acrylic. You could use wood. This is a completely unnecessary step and actually can backfire, and I'll tell you why in a minute.
Into the back side of the silicone. Now, this will all make sense later on, but the idea here is by cutting these little triangle-shaped keys in the top of the silicone, that's going to help the resin line back up later on. Now, it would be real simple to make a mold like this and just use a couple of pieces of scrap plywood cut down to fit this, but by cutting some keyways into that silicone and pouring some resin, what we can do is we wind up with a resin backing for this mold.
You can snap those scalpels.
And having those little keyways cut into the back of the silicone help us know which side is which when later on
I'm giving this
a slightly
mold
different
maker's
on each side of the mold. So the resin backing will know exactly which side fits which. And again, that'll make more sense later on. But by doing this, by cutting this out, cutting these little keyways in here, and then pouring resin on the back side of the silicone mold, we have a nice, tidy kind of mold sandwich later on. Now, what I'm going to do before I pour my resin is I'm going to release that mold box with some Pardal high-temp wax.
So it's another step, right? Because the resin is going to want to stick to the mold box. You don't even need the resin in the mold box.
Now, the high-temp wax is better when you're dealing with a resin that exotherms, like the TC800 that we'll be using here. What we're going to do is mainly use that to keep the resin from sticking to that mold box, because resin will want to stick to plywood. So it's real important to make sure you get that paste wax applied all over the inside of that mold box, and also down into those keyways. And once that's applied...
So if you're just learning mold making and you see somebody doing all these extra steps, you think you need to do these extra steps because you don't want to be afraid that you're making a mistake that's going to cause you to lose all of your hard work. The thing is that after you make molds long enough, you realize what shortcuts you can take, sometimes because you forget something and you learn that, oh, the thing I forgot actually wasn't as critical, so maybe I'll skip that next time. Or somebody says, hey, you know what? You can do it that way and you'll be fine. And that oftentimes starts to begin saving hours. And there's just not a lot of people that are talking about the mold making, I guess. I don't know.
You want to allow that to dry. And then we're ready to pour our TC800. And another one of the reasons that I like this method is it's inevitable if you do any of this work for any length of time, you're going to have resin sitting around, partial kits of resin sitting around your shop. And this is a great use for that extra resin.
No, it's
so what
not.
I'll do is figure out roughly how much resin it's going to take using that same volume formula, figure out about how many cubic inches of...
If you have extra resin sitting around in your shop, make something nice.
backer I need on this.
Okay.
And I'll mix up some resin and pour that over the backside of the mold.
So
again,
what do we got here?
Nice
$40, $30 worth of resin?
That I can then later just strap that whole assembly together, and it makes for a nice tidy mold box.
What
now,
I said
about TC800 casting resin.
How this can backfire is some resins, if you use them in their too fast setting and you pour them, they warp. And then all of a sudden your mother mold, which is supposed to have perfect registration with the silicone, is now a contoured, like a warped piece of wood. And so for that reason, I never really was thrilled when I had to make flat pieces of resin. They always distort.
So just kind of a basic casting resin formula, but it's also a really hard casting resin formula.
Gloves.
So we don't have to worry about this warping when it's all strapped together. But TC800 has about a 2 to 2.5 minute working time at room temperature, and about a 15 to 20 minute demold depending on the cross section. So as soon as that catalyzes, when this cures, it changes color. This will cure bright white. So once that cures completely, we're ready to pull off our mold box.
You can see how it shrunk away from the boards a little bit, so there's a slight contraction, not critical.
Now, most all of the work on a mold like this is going to be on that parting line and that clay on the first half of the mold. Once that's done, it's really downhill from there, because once you've defined that parting line with your clay, the rest of this is pretty straightforward and pretty simple. But one of the other nice reasons for using the water-based clay over oil-based clay is cleanup is very easy on this. Because once we peel off that water-based clay, we're ready to just use a
oil clay cleans up nice too.
Paper towel to wipe away any of that clay residue that might be on the other side of our model. So very easy cleanup. Again, though, you want to do this pretty quick and get all this turned around so you can immediately pour the second half.
Oh, he just whacked the detail on that.
So a mold like
that
this,
had nice lettering.
Because it does have a fairly quick set time on that 5140, it is possible to pour a mold like this in a single day. Now, if you're working in a warm shop in the summer here in Texas, you could probably do it even faster than that. But because of that 4-hour set time, it was easy for us to make the first half of this mold and have it set up by after lunchtime, and I was able to open everything up and pour the second half of the mold, and then I let the second half set overnight. Now here I'm using some of the scrap water-based clay to go in.
Well, speed is important for special effects people,
because
but
again, if we
in a
don't
mold making
seal those
shop,
edges, that silicone will leak out those corners. So make sure.
We used to time our pours so that we'd box everything up and we'd pour before we left in the evening, because then we'd come back in the morning, it'd be ready to unmold. So the day was prep, the night was cure. There's sometimes when you do, you'd flip the box, which we call what you do 1 or 2 pours a day. Sometimes we do 3 pieces a day, and you can accelerate them with heat that he's saying, but we used to use chemical accelerators.
Sure you seal up all of those edges around where the silicone meets back up with the box, because once you break that seal in the first half and reassemble the mold together, it will want to leak out those areas. So make sure you seal everything up, and when in doubt, you can always come around the outside of the mold box with a hot glue gun and seal everything up there for extra protection. Now ready to apply more of our Zip 301 mold release. Now we want to spray that thoroughly all over that exposed.
I feel like holding my breath.
And all over our pipe wrench and the mold box, but also really important to take a disposable brush and brush that into all the details there, because that very fresh silicone that we used for the first side.
No. The whole purpose of spray is that the particles of the spray are getting into all these small things, and that's the important reason for spraying. It's not spray and then brush and then spray and then brush. You don't have to do it. No.
Side of the mold. If we're not
spray
careful,
and don't
this is where
disturb
we
it,
could have
because now you can create a texture.
This new silicone that we're about to pour and that first half of the mold. So make sure you get everything released properly and give it adequate time to dry. I usually let this sit for about 20 minutes before I pour the second half of the mold. And now this is more 5140 that we've mixed up and vacuum degassed and ready to pour that over our pattern.
This has less air in it.
As a rule, I like my tolerances to be about a ½ inch over the highest point of the pattern. You may not have to go as thick on some patterns.
Oh, this is interesting. A ½ inch over the highest part of the pattern is really not necessary, because if you have a piece like this that has a point, and that's just 3% of the model, and the rest of the model is like this, I mean, Why would you pour a ½ inch above that? If you have a model that has some high points, you don't have to go very much above that at all. You just burn in material. We would just, for the mold itself, I would go 1/4 inch thickness on my pouring indication line. And if we had high points, I would short it.
Patterns, but to make a nice thick mold
That's
that
a
holds
lot
up
of
well in
silicone.
production, those are...
The other thing that I wanted to say is, at the beginning I should have commented, he's working on a table here that's designed for cameras. It's nice how it frames everything. But I can't tell if his table is level. And because he's not on a work board, his mold process is kind of welded to the work table. And what that means is he can't tip it or pivot it as easily. If you have a work board underneath your mold box, you can always drop a shim under 2 sides and begin to level things out. Leveling matters when you have open face molds, not so much with 2 parts, but it's good to be thinking about it.
Kind of the tolerances I go
You okay?
for is about a ½ inch of clearance over my part. And again, remember that we have a 30-minute working time and about a 3 to 4 hour demold at room temperature. If
That's
you're working
fast.
in a warmer environment, if it's 85 to 90 degrees, that's going to go a lot faster. So be aware of that. And
If we were in a hurry, we used to set the molds outside. He's not wrong about that. But you don't want to introduce your mold into heat too fast. If it's a liquid silicone and you put it in under a heat lamp or in some sort of accelerated heating environment, the liquid silicone will actually rise and it distorts. So you've ruined your mold if you put in heat too fast.
time you're working with new formulas like this, it's always a good idea to keep a timer handy to keep track of your working time, because it's easy for that time to get away from you if you're not careful.
I don't
Now, this is
understand
about 4 hours later, and we're ready to do the same business on this side of the mold. Go in with a scalpel and
His
cut
mold's
out more
perfectly
key
flat. You don't
ways
need a
for that
registration
second half, and you'll notice
key
I'm
at all,
cutting
in
these
my mind.
in different places than the previous side, and that is, of course, by design, because I want it to be very clear which half of the mold goes with which half of the mold of the resin backing.
It's not a textured
And of course,
back.
once I'm done cutting out those keyways,
He's
I'm going
creating
to release
the
that
texture.
with more of that Pardal high temp paste wax. And
He already
again, the
waxed
reason for
the-
that Pardal
the
high temp
mold.
wax is TC800 does exotherm fairly hot when it goes off. So paste wax is okay, but that high temp paste wax is even better, and that just protects the wood
Wow.
against that resin trying to bond to the wood. And sometimes with some paste waxes, you could have that resin exotherm and actually melt through the wax. So the Pardal high
Never
temp
happened
wax
in my
is
life.
extra protection against that. And now ready to pour the second half of our resin backing for our mold. And again, this
He's
is
got
more
gloves
of
on
the
this time.
TC800
High
casting
five.
resin. And again, TC800 has about a 2.5 minute working time and about a 15 to 20 minute demold at room temperature. And it's mixed 1-to-1 by volume. So very simple resin. But again, one of the reasons I like this approach for making 2-piece molds is this is a great way to use up extra resin sitting around in partial kits, making these backings for these molds like this. Now,
So what we used to do with our extra resin is we had a couple things. I used to make cheats. They're basically, we have them in the shop. We'll take some pictures. Remind me, Kay. And they're basically triangle corners that were, I would cheat boxes across these corners all the time. And what I created is I made a mold of these triangular bars. And then in that mold, I would dump my extra resin. And so I would have these, I had these bars of, I could make these resin bars that I could then be putting in my mold boxes at any time. And because we used to run so many mold boxes at one time, it was good to have 10, 12 of each size, and we had different sizes. So for me, that resin was expensive, so I would build a tool out of it, not just dump it like
one
this.
last little step I like to do, I didn't show this with the first half, but just giving a quick blast of that E236
Yeah, it
mold
does,
release
but you don't need to
break
buy
the
it to do
surface
that.
tension, and that gets us a nice clean surface on our mold, and we're ready to let
It's
our
very
resin
effective,
set
though.
up. And now we have our finished mold ready to disassemble. Now, I let this set up overnight because I poured it at the end of a workday.
Okay.
But real important to remember that we could easily demold that in about 3 to 4 hours, especially if we're in a warm workshop.
Okay.
So again,
So it's
that 4
fancier
hour
than it
demold
needs to
time,
be
you
is
can
what
always
I'm-
speed
what
that
I'm
up with
saying.
heat. But as it is, that 30-minute working time and 4 hour demold, that is plenty fast for most projects. And again, the nice thing about this is we wind up with that nice, really firm silicone that's excellent.
So this is another reason that I like to pigment silicone, is because the cleanup afterwards is the translucent material is very hard to see flaws in, but when it's colored or more opaque, those flaws jump out very quickly.
For casting foam like this.
Those
Now I'm just going to
scalpels.
go in with a
Yikes.
scalpel and clean up any little bits of silicone that, because again, this is a pipe wrench and some of that silicone seep down into the mechanical part of that
Well, he
wrench.
can see
Just
things that
cutting
the camera's not
extra
picking up,
silicone
you know.
away. And again, remember those vents that I mentioned earlier. So we have our pipe wrench, and again, you want to think of it upside down when we're pouring in. We want to think about those points where it dead ends, those high points like that, that will trap air bubbles. So we want to be mindful of those, and those are the areas where we're going to cut our vents. So we're going to take a scalpel and cut some little V-shaped trenches in the inside of the mold. And remember, these don't need to be huge. We just need some thin little trenches or a thin little pathways for that air to vent out. And what that does is allows those air bubbles to escape when they're compressed into those high points of the mold. So as our foam is expanding, that allows the air to get pushed out of the way. So again,
see his hand shaking because he's like, "Damn it, I got a scalpel in this other hand."
V-shaped trench in that mold and connect.
And those scalpel cuts, they're so clean. You know how people go with a paper cut and they're like, "Yeah,
and connect that part right back to the handle of the wrench.
It's to the nerve.
There. So again, just going from the high point there across.
I did that when I was doing that MTV award, and I filleted my thumb
just enough so that that air,
air
gets compressed into that section. The foam can actually fill up that whole area and push that excess air out into the handle and, of course, out the top of the mold. So very simple way to create vents, and the main reason I'm doing it like this after I made the mold rather than building those.
But he doesn't cut himself, so he doesn't. Oh, he could right here. Let me tell you about this. So wait, let's see.
Cast before you know exactly where those spots are. So
okay, this is a hidden little Jeopardy line right here. That ridge line on that resin is razor sharp because there's like the meniscus of the resin created this blade. He's absolutely doing the right thing with his Sureform to drag that and shave that. The trouble is this resin is really slippery. What I would do, he's using his right hand, is I would put on a leather work glove and then I would shave with that, because so many times I used to take a bad slice right across these knuckles here because I would be using the Sureform and the Sureform would slip, and then I would just be dragging my knuckles across this really sharp resin. It's no joke, folks. I mean, and I was awake when I was doing it. It's like I was paying attention and it would still slip. This stuff does not always carve. I think the trouble is if you have a dull Sureform blade, it kind of skips across the top. The sharp brand new blades will really bite in and you won't have any trouble. But I took some nasty cuts this way. So
just remember, you can always add vents to a mold. You can't.
I did it enough for you guys already.
Now I'm using a wood rasp to clean up the edge.
You see? You can see the blade right there. The light is catching the meniscus right there, and it is so freaking sharp.
Edges of that resin backer, and our mold is ready to use. But you see how we have that nice, tidy little mold sandwich. And here I brushed in some metal pigment powder into our wrench mold that will then transfer to the part. And what I'm pouring up here is some of the TC284 flexible foam. Now, TC284 is a variable density flexible foam, and it goes fast. So you'll see I'm having to move like a crack-addled spider monkey here. But the 284 can...
TC, terribly costly. No, I don't know. I really don't know. It doesn't matter. Everybody has their own things. The thing is he's using these compression clamps on this mold, and what happens is if you haven't pre-calculated the strap, you can pull it too tight when your product is in the mold, and then it pushes the mold tighter, and his wrench that was this thick is now this thick. And again, for movie props, it doesn't matter, but you've just distorted all the things you tried to preserve. You tried to preserve the correct dimensional stability of this, and this sandwich mold just got tight.
Up to an 8-pound density, which is what we're using here, or a really dense 13-pound density. So a lot of possibilities.
Somebody told me, and I don't know if this is true or not, but somebody said that when the foam is activating, that it's off-gassing a lot. So you really don't want to be, this is a very small amount of foam, but somebody told me you didn't want to be around that. I got to look into that.
With that, but this particular foam, again, it goes off pretty quick.
I mean, it's pretty, but
a
little kid would be like,
get that mold secured. And then our demold time on this, I usually like to let it sit for about 30 to 45 minutes before I demold. And stay tuned for a more thorough casting video featuring the TC284 flexible foam. But that'll give you a basic idea of how this mold works. But you see the whole idea there of brushing that pigment powder mold is that uses the adhesive potential of that 284 to bond and pull those metal powders out of the mold. And give us a part that takes very little finishing work to get a nice, realistic foam prop wrench. And here I'm just dry brushing some of the Sculpt Nouveau Silver B metal coating over top of that. And now we have a fight scene prop that's ready to bonk some zombies on the head. So there you have the process of making a 2-piece mold for a prop pipe wrench using the 5140 firm silicone rubber.
Okay. This is what I have to say about that is if your end result is for fun, your mold doesn't have to be precise. And everything he did here is not incorrect at all. It's just a little more expensive and a little more time consuming than is my preference. But remember, I'm biased because my product was the molds. I had to sell something that was very pretty, and a lot of other people don't care about the molds. They just need it to work good enough. And in this case, good enough was really great because he has other talents. He has good finishing skills with color, and the application really looked great. So I would say for his application, he's really done a terrific job. And in the movies, it's going to be 5 stars. So the Oscar goes to the wrench guy, right? I think he did. Although I differed with techniques, he did really well. That's what I got. See, even the rabbit gave you 2. It's his vote, not mine. Okay, you good?
I'm perfect.
That's why I asked that question.